All right, folks. So the campaign of demystification continues. Today, I'm going to be talking about the civil rights movement and thinking about ways we can think about this more broadly, but still encapsulate the essence of what, in effect, is one of the most influential social movements in recent history, not just American history, but world history. I'm going to go back beyond, by the way, the 20th century and set the tone by thinking intently about what African Americans were actually fighting against. I call this kind of Tocqueville's quandary. You know, roughly 25 years before the American Civil War, a French aristocrat who we see here on the screen named Alexis de Tocqueville wrote a book called Democracy in America in 1835, and he made some very splendid observations about American society, what at that time was still democracy in its infancy. And Tocqueville made a lot of splendid observations about American culture. And for all of its, these observations and its glaring limitations, his observations about race have stood the test of time. In some ways, they shape how I believe we should think about the struggle for racial equality after emancipation. And thinking about America's strange juxtaposition of liberty and freedom, which, by the way, were not incompatible. American freedom required slavery. And if you go back and you read anything by the founders, it's abundantly clear that is the case. He defined the choices available to slave owners rather simply. He said that the United States could free enslaved peoples and treat them with some degree of dignity, or perpetuate African American serfdom for as long as possible. Because he recognized that the possibility of Black freedom intensified rather than alleviated white prejudices. And we know now that the United States chose the latter. The story of Jim Crow South is the story of the perpetuation of African American serfdom. And it's defined by a set of beliefs designed to justify that serfdom and a set of political practices that entrenched that serfdom, but also African American resistance to both of these things. And I'm just going to talk about segregation. Sometimes we think about it in the most benign ways, right? Water fountains, segregated public accommodations. But the story of segregation is much more complicated than that, and part of the part much darker. Southern African Americans are not citizens of the United States until 1965. For reference, I was born in 1975. My mother was born in 1951. So this isn't ancient history. So is that Jim Crow as law. Over the course of the late 19th century, Jim Crow laws emerge episodically. They don't emerge. Jim Crow doesn't emerge fully realized after 1865. It takes time. And it emerges particularly at the state and local levels by sanctioning actual de jure segregation of Blacks and whites in public life. On the one hand, and private life, Southerners designed these laws to strip recently emancipated freed people of their constitutional rights, especially the Reconstruction Amendments. On the other hand, though, Jim Crow laws helped Southerners not only reduce Black folks to second-class citizenship, it helped reorganize the Southern class system and the South's Black labor force. The Supreme Court then comes in and rubber stamps segregationist prerogatives in an 1896 case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And Plessy mandated that racially segregated facilities did not violate the 14th Amendment. De jure segregation and separate but equal, which was established by Plessy, lasted until 1954, when the Supreme Court struck down Jim Crowism in a case that many of us know as Brown versus Board of Education. The thing to note here is that it emerges episodically or incrementally over the course of the twilight of the 19th century and is eventually rubber stamped by the Supreme Court. But Jim Crow's life mattered as well. Jim Crow was more than a series of rigid anti-Black laws. It was a way of life. African Americans were relegated to the status of second-class citizens and systematically stripped of wealth, of resources, and of infrastructure. And that's something that, until recently, especially in popular history, has not been discussed. Jim Crow represented the legitimization of anti-Black racism. And this lasts well into the 20th century. So what was then the movement? Which, by the way, we now know, I'll talk about, I don't want to steal my own thunder here. Let's talk about the traditional definition of the civil rights movement, how it's generally taught. The American Civil Rights Movement was the 20th century's most popular struggle for rights in the Western world, flat out. And protest, it was really defined in the traditional sense by protest movements, immediately instigated by backlash to public school desegregation after 1954. It was characterized, these demonstrations characterized what became the movement. These protests were designed, of course, especially within the context of the Cold War, to shame America in the court of public opinion, to bring attention to and eventually undermine segregation and institutional discrimination in the American South, right? The movement is defined by strategic campaigns of civil disobedience, for example, sit-ins and freedom rides, boycotts, and they're designed to address the deep infringements that I talked about on the previous slide of African Americans' constitutional and human rights violations throughout the Jim Crow South. This movement materializes in the traditional sense during the 1950s and the early 1960s. The culmination of this movement is realized, of course, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But I think we need to look at this movement, and historians have been on this some time. You know, one of the biggest dilemmas that historians struggle with is origins and endings. So when did the movement actually begin? And I think by looking beyond the legacy of direct action protests and civil disobedience, we see that this movement was much longer and more complex than it's been given credit for. The civil rights movement is in part an ideological effort to reclaim Blacks' humanity within the context of American democracy and freedom, right? Assuming that, you know, that Brown somehow inspired African Americans to finally resist Jim Crow segregation doesn't jive with the historical sources. I mean, it's just the way we tell Rosa Parks, right? You think Rosa Parks was the first African American to ride a bus during Jim Crow South whose feet hurt? No, there were any number of people we now know throughout the late 19th and the early 20th century that resisted Jim Crow segregation. And we know now that the movement far predated the 1950s. Some might say it began with the rise of segregation itself. After this is a freedom struggle more broadly, where African Americans not only sought basic constitutional protections, but they also challenged generations of institutionalized racism by activating the machinery of their communities, right? Of course, here we see Bob Moses, top left. We have Whitney Young on Time Magazine. There's a reference there to Hidden Figures, and there's A. Philip Randolph and a core group of people, including John Lewis, in front of the Lincoln Memorial. What they do, according to historian Charles Payne, or what he once argued, was they tap into these kind of long-standing organizing traditions that were passed down generationally from people who had found ways to live with and resist Jim Crow segregation well before the Montgomery bus boycott in the mid to late 1950s. And there are some distinct strategies that characterize the movement that go beyond the kind of elementary way that we have described what took place in the 1950s and the 1960s. One of them is community organizing, where civil rights organizations such as the National Urban League and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress for Racial Equality, which was CORE, focused on long-term leadership development in ordinary men and women. In lieu of protest, these community organizers sought to empower locals by emphasizing things like voter registration, local employment, the importance of local government in making change. This is revolutionary, by the way, because they're doing this in the South. These groups believe most importantly in teaching and empowering by example. And what many of these young people, especially in SNCC and CORE, found out when they went into areas in the Deep South in Mississippi, in Alabama, and Georgia, was that many of these African Americans were already organized. They already had all the apparatus to resist the mechanisms of Jim Crow. What many of us are familiar with when we think about the civil rights movement is community mobilizing. These are civil rights organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, fought against segregation by focusing on large-scale, relatively short-term public demonstrations. Community mobilizing has received significantly more media attention and initially scholarly attention, simply because it was about spectacle. It was about drawing attention to the deep inhumanities of Jim Crow through direct action protests and civil disobedience. But it's also received significantly more attention in large part because of charisma. Many of the people who were involved with this kind of, people have this kind of psychological inclination to be attracted to histrionics and speechification. And many of the people who were involved with community mobilizing were these people, namely Martin Luther King, right? Many of the people who were involved in community organizing worked behind the scenes. Often these groups of the community mobilizing tradition used the media to expose Southern racism in the court of public opinion, and they employed nonviolent direct action protest almost exclusively, but I don't want people to walk away thinking that the SCLC and some of these other organizations that are committed to this aren't also working behind the scenes, because they were. So in summation, I want you to think about the struggle for civil rights being much longer than it's been given credit for, and that African Americans had tapped into traditions of organizing that I will talk about in another video, thinking about Black leadership. The struggle continued well beyond the realization of civil and voting rights. The civil rights bills of the 1960s met firm resistance. We also struggle with endings, as I said, right? It's not as if the United States passed the civil rights bills and people accepted them generally. No, there was resistance. And the struggle against the rights revolution of the 1960s carried well into the twilight of the 20th century, and it survived the 20th century, in some ways characterizes some of the litigation that's going through the Supreme Court right now as we speak. But if you're still curious, look up the big six of the civil rights movement. Google the civil rights organizations such as the NAACP, created in the early 20th century, the National Urban League, CORE, SNCC, Black nationalism, accommodationalism, civil rights unionism. Some of these things will give you a clear sense of not only these long-standing traditions of African Americans and their white counterparts who had organized to resist the vestiges of Jim Crow segregation, but also how these things characterize or came to characterize what became the civil rights movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. Thank you very much.